Hey, welcome to this free training seminar on my 7 mixing breakthroughs of 2014. My name is Joe Gilder from HomeStudioCorner.com, and thanks for coming and hanging out with me tonight. Or if you're watching the recording, I hope this is helpful for you as well, but especially those who could make it to the live training seminar. I'm glad you're here, and I'm excited to share kind of the 7 strategies I discovered that helped me become a better mixer this past year. As I'm shooting this, there's only a couple of days left in 2014, and I've mixed a lot of songs, and I've tried a lot of new things and had a lot of pretty interesting breakthroughs. And I've shared most of these throughout the different channels of Home Studio Corner over the last year, but I'm putting them all kind of in one place here. So you can have, and by the end, you'll have a nice list of things that you can try. And maybe some of these you do already. Maybe some of them you don't think will work for you. But I guarantee there's probably at least 1 or 2 things that you'll learn in the next few minutes that will help you make better mixes next year. That's what this is all about, right? So, without any further ado, let's get going. For those of you here live on the webinar, I will be answering questions, but I'm probably going to save those until the end, have a Q&A section there. But feel free to fire those away as I go, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. We have a lot of people registered, and a good chunk of them have shown up already, so we'll see how many I can get to. But without wasting any more of your time, let's jump in and do this. So breakthrough number 1. So again, real quickly, these are things that obviously I do a lot of mixing throughout the year, whether it's my own music, client work, dueling mixes, whatever that is. And real quickly, I'm going to show these to you. I'm not selling anything at the end of the webinar. Normally, I have a webinar where I teach something and then I also sell you give you a resource that you can invest in. This is completely free. I just sent this out to my email subscribers as just a thank you. Kind of a belated Christmas present, though. Anyway, thanks. So these are breakthroughs and things that kind of aha moments for me over the year. Some of them small, some of them huge, some of them completely changed the way I work. Some of them were just subtle changes that had a big impact over time. And these are the things I'm going to share with you tonight. So let's just jump in and talk about breakthrough number 1. So the first breakthrough for me, and I talk about this a lot in speed mixing and understanding mixing, is what I call backwards mixing. Maybe you've heard me talk about this before, and maybe if you haven't, I'm going to explain it here. If you have heard me talk about this before, maybe it's worth talking about again, because it took me several times of thinking about this and trying it to actually jump in and actually do it. And I'm so glad I did, because I feel like it's made a huge impact both in the quality of my mixes, but also in the speed at which I'm able to mix. Which, if you're anything like me, you're busy, right? You have limited time to spend in the studio. And even whatever amount of time you have is never enough, right? That you always wish there was more. Whether you only have a couple hours a month to spend in the studio or you're in there every day, either way, you wish you had more time. And one way to capture more time is to do things more quickly and efficiently and get more done in less time. So this breakthrough number 1 is one of the biggest breakthroughs that I had, that I really started to implement this year in my mixing. And you've probably seen some of that in the different videos and podcasts and everything that I've put out. I've talked about it. But I'm going to explain kind of what that is and why it's so cool. So backwards mixing is the opposite of forwards mixing. It's kind of the opposite of the traditional common sense approach to mixing, where you'll take, let's say you have a typical drum or a typical rock mix, drums, bass, guitars, vocals, that kind of thing, keys. Typically, the way I mixed for years and years and years, and the way I saw everybody else mixing, I didn't know any other way of doing it, is I would start with, on the far left of my session, start with a kick drum. I'd bring it up, I'd EQ, compress, get all that stuff, then I'd move on to the next one. And keep going down the line until I had everything turned up and EQ'd and compressed how I liked it. The bad part about that is, I spent a lot of time listening to tracks by themselves. So the solo button was a big enemy, because yes, it's nice to hear the kick drum by itself, but it doesn't really matter what that sounds like, because how it sounds with the other drums and in the entire mix is what matters. And typically what it sounds like by itself sounds nothing like what it sounds like in the mix. That's a really hard lesson to learn. And unless you know of an alternative, you'll just keep doing it over and over, because there's really no way to know. It's not an intuitive thing to do this mixing backwards. It makes sense to start your session with drums and then add in bass and add the guitars and EQ them each individually as you go and compress and all that stuff. But it's not the best way to do it. I'm not saying it's wrong, and I'm certainly not saying you can't get a good mix that way. But for me, this is all about kind of breakthroughs that I've had. I've made huge steps in improvement and quality by taking that and turning it on its head. And so what does this backward mixing mean for me? For me, it means mixing every track in my session through a bus. So I have separate buses for each group of tracks in my session. Now, how many buses you have is up to you. For me, I typically have drums, bass, guitars, maybe a separate electric and acoustic bus, keys, vocals, background vocals. Those are my core buses that I have. And I route everything in my session through one of those buses. If I have some other stuff that doesn't fit, maybe a bunch of percussion tracks, I'll create a percussion bus maybe. But everything in my session goes through those buses. So if I mute those buses, or auxiliary tracks, or how your system may call them something different. If I mute all the buses, then my entire session is silent, and that's the way it's supposed to work. So then what I'll do is I'll start with the buses first, and then work my way backwards to the individual tracks. Great example, a great way to kind of flesh this out in your head is with drums. Instead of pulling up the drums and starting on the kick drum, or starting on the overheads, or starting on any one piece by itself, I'll set levels for the entire drum kit. And I'll route them all through a drum bus. This is just a stereo bus, a stereo aux track, whatever your system calls it. And then before I do anything to the individual tracks, I'll put usually EQ and a lot of times compression on my drum bus. And I'll use that, probably just a subtle 1 or 2 EQ moves, and maybe some fairly aggressive compression, and I'll get that dialed in until the drums sound really, really good with just those 2 processes just on the bus. Then from there, I'll go back and I'll do individual adjustments to the overheads, the room mic, the toms, the snare, the kick, if they need it. And that's the big takeaway point, if they need it. If you work forwards and you start on the kick drum, you're going to automatically put some EQ and compression on there because you just feel like you're supposed to. And then by the time you get through the entire drum kit, you've mixed every piece of the kit, then maybe what you do is route it through some sort of a bus, because you hear people talk about drum bus processing. And so you've got EQ and compression on almost every track in the drums. Then you put some more EQ and compression on your drum bus, and then you wonder, man, why do my drums lack any punch? Why aren't they hitting hard? Why does it sound so lifeless and strangled? It's because you've got so much going on that doesn't have to happen. For me, I've had times where I will put literally a little bit of EQ and 1 compressor on my drum bus, and the drums are probably 90% there. And then I go back and do a few subtle things, a lot of times just with EQ on the individual pieces of the kit, and it works really well. And I'm leaving off so much processing. It's really the art of leaving things alone is where the real core of backward mixing comes in, and why it's so beneficial, because you do less and less on the individual tracks. You work on a more global, big picture level, and it allows you to not get caught up in things that don't matter, which we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Nicholas has a question, says, do you go through the whole process of mixing when mixing the buses, or is it more like quick changes? Not sure I understand your question, but basically, yeah, I'll do everything on the buses first, and then I'll stop and work my way backwards from there. So I'll say, now that I've done the bus processing on drums, bass, guitars, everything else in the session, what else needs to be worked on? What else can't I fix on the buses? And then you kind of go from there. Okay, so that's my breakthrough number 1, is backwards mixing. How do you set that up? It's really easy. Pull up a session and set up a bunch of buses. I like to put them all on the far right-hand side of my session so they're all together. And create one for drums, one for bass, one for guitars, whatever you have in your session, and then go through and just route every track, every audio track in your session to one of those buses. And then don't allow yourself to touch the audio tracks until you've successfully set things up well on the buses. You'll want to set levels first, do your static mix, get everything balanced and panned if you want first. That's fine. But then don't do any EQ and compression until you've done some heavy lifting on those buses. And I think you'll find, especially the first 30 minutes to an hour, you can get so much done by just hanging out on that handful of buses. Instead of having a 50 track song to mix, you're narrowing it down to really 5 or 6 tracks because you're only working on those buses. And a good question coming in from Dan, and I'm glad you pointed it out. Why would you need a bus for a single bass track? Just use the track. Yes, that's a good question. If you have one bass track, which most sessions do, it does seem a little bit repetitive to have a bass bus. For me, I do it anyway because I want everything in my session routed through a bus. And for me, a lot of times, it's not uncommon for me to halfway through mixing to take that bass track and duplicate it and add distortion on it or do something else to that. And once I do that, now I don't have a single fader for my bass. Now I have two faders and two tracks, and it's not all going through the single kind of core processing, which is the way I like to use it. So I'll set up a bass bus. Sometimes I don't do anything but just process it like I would the individual track, and that's fine. It takes an extra 2 seconds to set it up, and then I've got on the right-hand side of my session drums, bass, guitars, vocals, keys. Instead of having drums, guitars, vocals, keys, and then my bass track is somewhere way off to the left, it doesn't feel as organized. So I like to have everything. I'm kind of an all or nothing kind of guy. I like to have everything going, kind of doing the same thing, if that makes sense. Jeff is asking, do you always put a compressor on the mix bus? If so, do you do that first when you're doing your initial volume and pan balance? I do almost always do a bus compressor. I usually don't let it do too much, though. A couple dB of compression, that's about it, is enough to tighten things up. As far as when I do it in the process, yes, exactly what you said. I add the bus right after I've done my static mix, where I've set basic levels and basic panning, and I've got pretty much the raw static volume mix set. Before I start doing much compression in EQ, I'll put the bus compression there. Good question. Okay, so that's breakthrough number 1, backwards mixing. This is one of those things, if you haven't tried it, you may think it sounds stupid, and I totally get that. I thought it sounded a little repetitive, a little unnecessary, kind of like you're spending all your time setting up your session instead of mixing, but it actually speeds up the process a lot. It doesn't take very long to set this up, and it could really change things. So what my encouragement to you, if you don't listen to any of the other 6 breakthroughs I'm going to talk about, this one could be a big game changer for you. If nothing else, it'll help you just get your mixes to a place you'd want them to be more quickly, which will get you more excited, which will help you do more mixing, right? Lewis is asking, wouldn't you want to make your adjustments right from the source, i.e. EQ and compression? I guess you're saying, wouldn't it make sense to EQ the individual tracks instead of EQing the bus? Well, and in theory, sure, maybe, but I don't think it matters. EQing a kick drum in isolation doesn't matter because how it sounds in the whole drum mix is what matters. And a lot of times the EQ moves that you do in isolation don't translate into the full mix. And so you end up wasting hours and hours sometimes making things sound great by themselves when they don't sound great on the whole. So for me, I found, here's a great example for drums. I almost always do some sort of an EQ cut at around 400 hertz. It may be a little bit lower, but generally somewhere around there, it's very boxy sounding typically, even if the drums are recorded well. So I usually find myself cutting there on kick drum, snare drum, a lot of times overheads, room mics, tom mics. So what I just listed there, I listed 5 different types of tracks where I do the same rough EQ cut. So you tell me which one makes more sense, to cut each of those tracks to do 5 separate EQ moves, or to put one EQ on the drum bus and do that cut at around 400 hertz. You see what I'm saying? By doing one move, we've killed 5 birds with that one stone. Now there are times at some point you'll know, hey, I can't make that snare drum sound thicker by doing any more processing to my drum bus. That's when you go to the individual snare track. But until then, you can knock out a lot of the work by working on your buses instead of the individual tracks, at least first. I'm talking about doing it first. I still think you should do a lot on the individual tracks, depending on the mix, but I think if you start there, you end up having to undo a lot of things to get it where you want it to go. Got another question, then I'm going to move on to stage 2 because we took a lot of time on this first one, but I wanted to because I think the backwards mixing is probably the most important thing I'm going to talk about. Alex says, how often do you end up going back and EQing or comping or compressing individual tracks? What makes you decide to do so? For me, I try to do as much as I can from the buses. And if it starts to get too aggressive or I'm having to do too much on the buses and it's hurting more than it's helping, then I go to the individual tracks. And like I mentioned a second ago with the snare drum, if I've got the EQ, everything's sounding good, but the snare drum needs a little bit more, or the kick drum needs a little bit more low end, or things like that, that's when I go in and start working individually. So I sit there and listen and say, what's wrong? And then I address what's wrong, right? I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in another game changer as well, another breakthrough. And just real quickly, Lewis said he should learn how to drive a bus, different kind of bus. And Nadim says, and Nadim's gone through understanding mixing. He says backwards mixing was a game changer for me, and that's for sure. So if you haven't tried it, if you're not sure, it doesn't hurt to try it. And if you hate it, let me know. But I have a sneaky suspicion you're going to like it. Okay, there are a few more questions. I'm going to have to keep moving on, folks. All right, breakthrough number 2. Here we go. Really knowing my frequencies. Now, I might be cheating on this one a little bit. I can't remember if this happened in 2014 or in late 2013, but it was a game changer for me either way, and I didn't do a mixing breakthrough video last year, so this will have to do. This comes back to my good buddy who I've never met in real life, Ian Shepard. If you haven't met Ian or seen his website, productionadvice.co.uk, you need to check it out. He's a veteran mastering engineer, was a pro mastering engineer at a really nice facility in England for, I want to say 15 years, and now he does a lot more stuff. He does a lot of stuff like Home Studio Corner. He's got a training course on mastering and all that stuff. But one of his training courses, I believe it was Home Mastering EQ, I was watching a video, and he made this distinction and gave this little exercise that kind of blew my mind. It was almost embarrassing because I'd been running Home Studio Corner for a while, and I hadn't thought of this particular way, and it was a game changer in both helping me explain this stuff, which is good for you, but in helping my own mixes as well. And it's talking about really knowing my frequencies. So specifically, he would go through, and he had maybe 6 or 8 kind of core frequency ranges or core frequencies that you need to get to know. And he started with 50 hertz, 100 hertz, and I think the next one was 2 or 250. And he went on all the way up to 8K and I think 12K. But the one that really affected me was the first 2. So 50 hertz and 100 hertz. So if you think about it, if you've not done an exercise like this before, you may think 50 hertz and 100 hertz are kind of the same thing, right? That's quote unquote low end. But you could not be more wrong. And I could not have been more wrong about this because I got this wrong for so long. So the exercise, and I want you to maybe write this down and go do it sometime. You can do it now if you want, but I'd recommend waiting and finishing this training. But go into a session, and the easiest way to do it is to pull a full mastered mix, like an actual mix into your session, not an individual track. It's a little harder to do. So find a song that you love, pull it into a session, turn it down a little bit so you don't blow out your speakers, and then take an EQ and make it pretty narrow and do a boost, set up 2 EQ bands, one at 50 hertz and one at 100, and then boost them quite a bit. And then just go back and forth and compare what a 50 hertz boost sounds like and a 100 hertz boost sounds like. Now, if you want to get nerdy and all mathematical on it, 100 is double 50, so it's an octave higher than 50. And up in the higher ranges, that doesn't matter. You go from 1 kilohertz to 2 kilohertz. That's just a tiny little move in EQ. It's not as big of a difference, but going from 50 hertz to 100 hertz is a huge difference. You're talking about completely different sounds. Now, obviously on a video like this, I can't show it to you. You can't hear it, but I would encourage you to go do this, and I'll explain kind of what I hear. The way that Ian described it was 100 hertz is kind of like the, and you have to do it with a British accent, but it's the hooting frequency. So it's when you hear something and it kind of feels like it's going hoo hoo, but a lot lower than hoo hoo. That's 100 hertz, okay? Roughly. It's around that range. And then the 50 hertz is really the low end frequencies that you feel. So you could wrap, 20 hertz up to 200 hertz and kind of call all of that, quote, low end. But there's so many differences there. So the kind of chest pounding, thumping low end, that happens down more so around 50 hertz. The more thickness and the kind of the thing that if you get it out of hand can give you a headache, but if it's missing, your mix sounds kind of hollow, is more around that 100 hertz. Now, don't take this literally and think it has to be 100 hertz. It could be, 120, 150. It could go down to, 80 or 90. But the difference from from doing EQ there and going down to around 50, 60 hertz and adjusting down there, it is night and day. Now, the same thing, if you don't know your frequencies in the other ranges as well, you need to know them as well. You need to know the difference between what 150 hertz sounds like and 300 hertz. That's very different as well. 500 hertz sounds radically different from 1,000 hertz. And then, 1 to 3K is more harsh nasally frequencies, and then up 8K and above is higher end kind of airy stuff. But it's stuff that you probably know, but a lot of times what I found, and over the years I've had more and more breakthroughs that help me understand this, but I tend to, what I think a frequency sounds like in my head and what it actually sounds like can be radically different. I've gotten this technique from Ian really opened my eyes to kind of how wrong I was about the stuff under 150 hertz. But years ago when I was mixing, I would think, man, this acoustic guitar sounds muddy. I'm going to go cut 500 hertz. And for some reason, I just thought 500 hertz is a muddy frequency. Well, guess what? It's not. I would do a cut and it might sound different, but the muddiness would still there, so I'd cut it more, or I'd go cut more frequencies. As it turns out, the muddiness was more like 200 hertz or 150 or 125, but I was the difference between 125 and 500 is pretty massive, right? You double it a couple times to get there. So I was way off, and it was all about taking the time to learn those frequencies. It's not a fun exercise. It's not going to be something that makes you super excited, but I guarantee the next time you're mixing something and you think, oh, this needs more 50 hertz, you're going to say that to yourself, and it's going to blow your mind because you've never said that before, and you'll know exactly what that 50 hertz range sounds like. You'll get this bigger kind of thick pumping low end that's not super muddy and doesn't muddy up the mix and makes it sound bad. Or vice versa, you'll get more thickness in your mix without overloading the super deep low end stuff. It is such a night and day thing. I'm so glad that Ian showed me that, and I get to show that with you. So if you haven't said thanks to Ian, say thanks and check out his stuff. Mike says, I like to put a low pass filter at about 120 hertz. It lets you just concentrate on the bottom and then work other frequency ranges too. Yeah, I mean, in mixing, typically I'm using a high pass filter on most things except for drums and bass, where I need the low end, or if there's a cello or some sort of an organ part that has a lot of deep notes that I want to keep in the mix. So that's kind of a given, and that was kind of a breakthrough I had several years ago. But now, as kind of an advanced, as I'm maturing, I guess, I realize that on the tracks that I do need to have low end present, knowing the difference between 50 and 100 hertz makes a huge, huge difference. Perry says he's having a light bulb moment right now. And he says he mostly does live mixing, and he just normally fishes for frequencies, and now he has a much better idea of what to look for. And that's exactly the point. You're going to spend some time. Live is hard because you can't just boost like crazy and sweep around because it sounds bad live, right? But you'll get to a point where more often than not, your guess will be right. You'll think, you know what? I think this needs to be turned down at about 120 hertz, and you'll find that you're almost dead on. Maybe you move up or down a little bit, but over time you'll almost feel like a magician because you'll be able to guess what frequencies need to be boosted or cut just from listening. And that takes a lot of time, and it takes doing some of this intentional listening and intentional boosting of frequencies and listening to what they sound like and comparing them. Stuff that sounds a little bit nerdy, it totally is worth it and pays off. Totally. Okay, let's move on to breakthrough number 3, shall we? Okay, so number 3 is global reverb. Now, this was one that I thought I was breaking a bunch of rules when I did this. And some people may say I am breaking rules, and I like that. So when I was learning about mixing and would study other different people, everybody talked about, when it comes to drums, for example, if you're going to use reverb on the drums, you put the reverb on, you use a send. You have your reverb set up on auxiliary track somewhere, and you use a send from your snare drum, and you send that. And maybe you send a little bit of the toms, and maybe a little bit of overheads if you want. But you certainly don't send things like kick drum and bass guitar and things like that. And you just send individual pieces of the mix that you want to have a little reverb on them. And I'm not going to say that's wrong. I think it can work fine. And the genre of music is going to be a big determining factor in what you should and shouldn't use, whether you should do this or not. But I found, and I've mixed lots of different styles of music, mostly kind of somewhere around the rock genre, and I found that this approach has yielded some really cool, fairly subtle, but pretty cool results for me. So what am I talking about? Global reverb is, what I'm calling global reverb is the idea of putting reverb on everything. Now, you could do this by putting a reverb on your mix bus and setting the mix knob to something like 10%. I don't do it that way because I like to have more control, and I don't want anything like that on my mix bus. But what I do is, as we talked about, remember, breakthrough number 1 was backwards mixing. So I already have these buses set up. What I'll do from there is I will set up a reverb, and I'll spend a fair amount of time making sure I've got the right reverb, one that fits the song, that has kind of the right amount of warmth and space to it. And again, I'm not talking 80s huge reverb with a 6-second reverb tail on it. I'm talking about something that just gives some space to the mix itself. And then what I'll do is I'll actually set up a reverb send on every one of those buses that I've set up. So my drum bus, my bass bus, guitar bus, vocals, all the other keys, guitars, all that stuff. And then I'll send a little bit of each of those to the reverb. Now, I know in the past people would say no, and I've said this before, don't send bass to the reverb, don't send kick drum and low frequencies to the reverb. And while maybe that's a bad idea, if you do it the way I'm going to show you, you can actually create this depth and thickness to your mix without making it sound super muddy and gross. Now, the one key thing that you have to do if you're going to send some of your kick drum or some of your entire drum kit and your bass track to the reverb is to put an EQ plugin on the reverb track. So usually I put this after the reverb. So I'll put an EQ plug in there and usually just put something like a high pass filter at something pretty high, like 200 hertz, maybe even as high as 400. So then what happens is you're sending all this low end goodness to your reverb, and then it's going into the reverb and it's creating this big thick sound. And if you don't have the EQ there, it's overwhelming and it sounds like too much. But if you EQ it afterwards, then you're still maintaining some of that thickness that's there, but none of the muddiness, if that makes sense. So everything in kind of that mid-range and above stays in the reverb sound and it gets added to your mix without adding any more low end. So you're just getting this kind of, it's almost like you took your mix and you gave it a big hug, and it backs away from the speakers a little bit. It doesn't sound quite as almost naked as maybe it sounded before. It's not obvious. You're not saying, oh, listen to all that reverb. It's a subtle thing. But suddenly, if you go in and you just mute the reverb and unmute it a few times, you'll hear it's as if all the instruments are kind of by themselves in the mix. And this is kind of towards the end of the mix when you've done all your EQ stuff and you're listening. But all the instruments may still sound like they're all very kind of separated. And sometimes that can be cool, but sometimes maybe you're wanting it to be a bit more cohesive. So by sending a little bit of everything to a reverb, when you engage that reverb, it literally sounds like, if you close your eyes, it sounds like all the instruments were right up next to the speakers, and suddenly they're pushed back just a little bit. They don't sound distant. It doesn't sound like you've drowned everything in reverb if you do this right. But they just bounce back a little bit, and they sound like they're glued together a little bit more. And it's subtle, it's little, it's not huge, but man, it makes a big difference. Big difference. And so if you haven't tried something like this, I encourage you to try it, but also make sure you set up that reverb. Set up that EQ. Some reverbs have a built-in EQ, and that's great. I like to put my own EQ plug-in after so I can adjust it by itself. But set it to at least a high-pass filter, meaning rolling off all low end below 200 hertz. Use that as a starting point. And then start sending a little bit of everything to it. I think you'll find you're kind of recapturing some of that vibe that maybe you're missing from your mixes. Good stuff. Got a bunch of questions here. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. Roger's asking, when do you start to do reverb in your mixing? I don't have a set point where I do it, unlike doing my static mix and doing my backwards mixing. But at some point, if I feel like I'm getting close to the sound I want, but I need reverb, then I'll add it. So it's more of a, this needs reverb. And that usually happens after I've done some basic EQ and compression. Sometimes it waits till the end of the mix, and that's fine too, especially if you roll off the low end, so you're not introducing a bunch of extra muddiness that's going to mess everything up that you've been doing for the last few hours. And Mike is asking, can you do that in every type of recording software? You should be. I mean, if you can add an EQ plugin, then you can add another plugin after it in the chain. That should be completely doable. Paul says, do you recommend avoiding stereo reverbs for this purpose? No, I say use stereo because I think a part of what it does is it can widen your stereo image field a little bit and gives it a little more width along with that depth that you're getting. And you can, sometimes I'll adjust the reverb. So maybe I'll put I have a plugin in Studio One that allows me to adjust the width of a track. Some DAWs just have the panning knobs that you can adjust them. So maybe I'll take the reverb. If it sounds too wide, I'll adjust it down, but I want some width there. I've never done just a straight mono reverb. I'm not saying that'd be wrong, but I like to have a little bit of that width there. Dan's asking, is the global reverb a hall, a plate, or a room? Usually, I think it ends up being a room, somewhat of a big room. Plates are cool, but they don't have any. Plates tend to sound more just like a reverb tail, which can work. I like that there can be a little bit of, in a room or a hall, there's a little bit of that pre-delay or that slapback that can happen. So you get a little bit of that. That's what helps with the depth a little bit, I think. Not that a plate can't work. But typically, the way I set up reverb, I talked about this in the, if you're a VIP member, you can check out a video I did on kind of 4 steps to setting up a reverb. And one of the things I do is I start with presets, and I just go through presets until I find one that sounds really close to what I want. So I'll turn the reverb way up momentarily while I'm looking for the right sound, and I'll cycle through different presets of reverbs until I find one that's really close. And then I'll adjust it a little bit, adjust the delay, the decay time a little bit, and then have the EQ plugin after it. But no, I don't do a lot of tweaking after that. So it usually ends up, as I'm going through presets, it ends up being kind of the large studio preset, if that makes sense, where it's kind of a big tracking room sound. That tends to work pretty well. Jeff says he has a stupid question. I noticed that some effects plugins come in mono, stereo, and even a mono/stereo version. Should a mono effect be used on mono tracks, stereo effects on stereo tracks? Yes, they should. Depending on your DAW, a lot of times it'll do it for you. Pro Tools, maybe not. I can't remember. I think you have to choose. Usually, like back in the Pro Tools days, if there was a stereo plugin, it wouldn't even give me the option of picking a mono plugin to put on that track. If I had a stereo track, it would only let me choose stereo plugins. So sometimes plugins would disappear because they only come in mono or only come in stereo, and I was trying to put the stereo plugin on a mono track, that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's an issue anymore. Okay, got to keep going. Breakthrough number 4. This is a big one. I stopped ignoring automation. Okay, so if you've been following me for a while, you know I like the idea of going quickly. I like the idea of getting it done. And I like the idea of doing a static mix. On my album, my last released album, the Hymns album is called Help of the Helpless. That whole thing was mixed through a small little 16-channel Studio Live 1602 mixer. And for the most part, I didn't do much automation. I just kind of pulled up a nice static mix, did all my settings, did some gain staging on different sections of the song that needed to be turned up or down globally, but didn't do any actual automation, mainly because I was mixing through a mixer that doesn't have automation, right? And I like that album. I think I did a good job. I like the sounds that I got, but one of the regrets, and every project you have is going to have some regrets, is that I didn't let those mixes come to life more. And one of the ways I've discovered this year of making those mixes really come to life and feel almost like a living being is by adding in automation. And typically I'm talking about volume automation. Simple things like having the guitars come up in volume a little bit just before that chorus. That just adds some more energy. Automating a lead vocal so you can hear everything he sings throughout the song, which is just kind of really basic stuff that I would try to ignore sometimes. To more subtle things like automating a reverb to come up and down during kind of more dramatic sections of a song. I learned that from watching a live sound guy. The entire show, he had his right hand on the reverb fader, and he would bring it in during sections of the song and take it back out. And it was really artfully done. And I've started doing that in my mixes a little bit, and it works really, really well. So the idea is it's a little more advanced, right? But it's simple too. The things that you can do with a digital computer-based system, you can automate everything. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about a few core things that can bring the mix to life, right? You know, if you've got a string section, and it would be great if it swelled in and then dropped out and then swelled in again. And it was the kind of thing that wasn't performed that way. You can perform it on a fader by doing just a little bit of volume automation. And this is one, there's not a lot to say about it. If you're not using any sort of kind of volume or even panning automation to bring some life into your mix, so it's not just a static mix from start to finish, I think you should. And this is something I've only the last few months I've really taken this more seriously and started applying it more and more and more. But I think it's had a big impact on me. And even if for me, knowing like have been sections of mixes that I've done where I've been too lazy to do a little bit of automation, even though I needed to do it. So a part where a guitar gets lost, or a vocal gets lost, or a vocal's a little too loud, and if I just spent an extra 2 minutes automating it, it would have made it that much better, and I've ignored it. So those are some regrets that I have with mixes that I wish I had done, and I'm starting to do that more and more with mixes moving forward. Okay, we're over halfway done. Let's jump to breakthrough number 5, and that is templates aren't the devil. Now, you may disagree with me on this. Shoot, I even disagreed with myself on this for years. So templates are, if you're not familiar with them, most DAWs allow you to create mixed templates where you've got the session set up kind of like you want it. They can be as detailed as having every single plugin you want on every single track with all the settings you want on the individual tracks. Now, that's not exactly how I use them, but I do use them when I'm mixing an album or a series of songs where they all sound roughly the same. I've started using templates to save time and to help me with keeping them cohesive. So in the past, here's how it would work. You send me 10 songs to mix. I mix the first one, and then I go mix the second one from scratch. And I try to remember what I did with the drums and try to remember kind of the basic reverb and EQ settings that I use to get that sound. And a lot of times, because it's the same artist and the tracks sound close to the same because they were recorded by the same person, I could still pull it off. But it ended up being more difficult. And there would be mixes from one mix to the next might have radically different drum sounds, even though I wasn't trying to. And now there's a part of that that's good. You should take each song on its own and make it sound as good as it needs to sound. But then there's a part of it that's just a waste of time. If you already spent a lot of time honing in the perfect snare sound and the overall drum sound on one song, there's a good chance the next song could use those same settings or something very close to them. So what I started doing, and I did this a little bit, and then I started doing it more and more and more, is I'll mix the first song, and I'll spend a lot of time on that first one. I'll hopefully pick one that's kind of one of the kind of quintessential songs on the album, the one that's most representative of what the album is supposed to sound like, okay? And I'll take that and I'll mix it. And then I'll get feedback from the client just on that first song. And if they're happy and they like the direction it's going, then I'll say, okay, I'll finish that mix, and then I'll take that specific mix and I'll save that as a template. So I'm not saving a global template that I use on every client. I'm starting the mix from scratch and on the first one, and then I create a template from that. And then using that template, I'll create a new session for the new song. I'll drag in all the tracks, drop them into the individual track that I've already created with all the EQ and fader levels and everything in place. And then once it's all dragged in, which takes a little bit of time to do, I hit play and hey, it's already sounding kind of good. Now, I still go through and listen to everything and adjust as needed, and that's the big kind of asterisk if I was going to put something on this breakthrough. You can't just pull in the files, hit play, and say, great, I'm done mixing. You still got to do a little bit of work. But it saves me a ton of time, and a ton of time that I don't need to spend. Sometimes you do need to spend more time. If you've got 3 rock songs and then this acoustic song with cello, then there's not much that you're going to save from your template to use on that really soft cello song. So you're going to do that one from scratch. But if you've got 3 or 4 rock songs in a row and they all have the same basic drum feel, if nothing else, if you just got the drums and bass and use the same rough settings on each, you'll find that you get there a lot faster. And it's not cheating, it's being smart. You know, if you think about it this way, what made me think about this was mixing a song last year on my Studio Live mixer. Actually running the tracks through my board. And what I would do is I'd mix the first song, and then I pull up the second song, and then just run the tracks through the same channels on the board. And as it turns out, it sounded pretty close. And then I do, tweak that one to get that sounding good. And that started to get me thinking in this idea of templates. So if you were using a big 48 channel SSL board to mix your album, chances are you're not going to mix song number 1, and then when it's time to mix song number 2, you're going to go zero out the board and move all the EQs back to 0 and then mix from scratch, right? Chances are you're going to say, I already did all this work. I might as well run the tracks through these settings and see if it sounds good. Now, it may sound horrible, and you may need to zero out everything, remove all the plugins and processes that you have in place. But there's a really good chance that it'll sound good, or it'll sound close, or you'll save yourself an hour of that mix to where you're starting kind of at the fun part, right? Setting up a mix can be boring sometimes. So if you already get to the point where it's sounding pretty good and you can just jump into those little tweaks and little changes that make a big difference, that's a lot more fun. And think about shaving an entire hour off your mix time with every song but the first one. That's a big deal. If you're charging by the song, you just, let's say you charge $100 for a song and it normally takes you 4 hours, so that's $25 an hour, and then suddenly you've knocked an hour off of your time. I mean, now you're doing the same amount of work. You're doing 3 hours of work for $100 as opposed to 4. So you went from 25 an hour to 33 an hour. That's pretty cool, right? So I know it's not all about money, but I think it's all about creativity as well and keeping yourself moving forward. So if this is your own music and you're not, paying yourself for it, this will keep you moving, keep the momentum going so you finish mixing a lot sooner than you would if you did everything from scratch. And Javier has a great question. He says, why not do the whole album in the same project? See, that's where it gets squirrely because if you do the same album in the whole project, then what if you want the vocal to be louder on song 2 than song 1? Or if it was recorded at a little bit different level? Then you've got to use automation just to set your levels, and it just gets annoying. And I think that's a horrible way to work because you have to automate everything for each song, and it just gets to be too much. What if you want to change the snare drum EQ because he's playing it differently on the second song? Well, then you've got to either automate that EQ from the first song to the second song to change the settings, and that doesn't sound fun at all. So keeping them in the same session, I think that makes the most sense. Keeping them in different sessions. One session for each song makes the most sense. But then saving a template from the first one and applying that to the second one, that might work pretty well. Okay, breakthrough number 6. The problem with problems. This one comes back to a mixing workshop I did actually here at my studio. I did a couple of them, but I did one specifically earlier this year. And one of my longtime VIP members, Tim Alexander, was here. And it was me and Tim, and I believe this one was 3 other guys. So they essentially came out on a Saturday, hung out with me all day in my studio, and we mixed. We worked on mixing. We talked about mixing. I showed them mixes. We mixed a song together. And it was one of those really fun afternoons or full days where they got to come sit next to me while I mixed. We got to mix things together and answer any questions they had. And so one part of that, after lunch, we sat down and put some of their music in and listened to it, and we talked about it and critiqued it and gave suggestions and all that fun stuff. And there was this one thing that Tim showed, and the preface to the song was interesting because he was saying basically, I've had so many problems recording and mixing lead vocals in my studio. There's just so much sibilance. If you're not familiar with sibilance, it's just the S's and T's, the st of a vocal, where especially with condenser microphones and dynamic mics, sometimes depending on the singer and the way it's recorded, it just, once you add in some compression and EQ, the S's and T's just kind of chop your head off, and it can be really annoying in the mix. It's a legitimate problem that comes up quite a bit. But what happened is he gave this kind of disclaimer about, hey, I don't know what to do. I've tried everything. I can't fix it. And so we're all expecting this, the worst sounding sibilance we've ever heard. And then he hit play and we listened, and I didn't notice any problems with sibilance. And everybody else, I thought maybe I was going crazy, and everybody else said, no, man, I don't think it's a problem at all. And so what had become a slight annoyance for him, and maybe there was legitimately too much sibilance at first, he had fixed it long ago, but he was just so focused on it that he kept making it a problem when it wasn't. So that's kind of what I had to include that as one of my breakthroughs, because it's important for me and for you to know when something is a problem and when it's not, or more accurately, when something is a problem that you can fix versus when it's a problem that you can't. So of all the projects I've mixed this year, there have been several where the mix or the potential for the song itself was really great. It could be an epic, wonderful, awesome song. But the problem is the tracks just aren't good enough for it to get there. And I could I could spend countless hours doing all the secret ninja mixing tricks that I could come up with, and it would only make it a little bit better. It wouldn't get it to this next level that I'm hearing in my head. And for me, it was I remember this one specific project, I was mixing it and I was thinking, it's just not getting where I want it to be. And it suddenly just hit me. And it was almost like I heard an audible voice that said, Joe, this is as good as this song is going to sound. And it wasn't this voice that says you're not good enough to mix this. It was a voice that said, this is as good as these particular tracks and this particular song. This is as good as it's going to sound. You're not going to dramatically transform this song with your EQ and compression moves. It's only going to sound as good as the raw tracks. Now, yes, our job as mixers is to enhance the sound and to do a really good job of taking what we're given and make it sound as good as possible. But we also have to know when something can and can't be fixed by us. And some of that just takes practice. Some of it takes wrestling with something for days and days only to realize you're not going to improve it. But hopefully, by me sharing this with you, hopefully that shakes that idea loose in your brain a little bit and maybe saves you a little time so you can decide what stuff are you going to focus on. Focus on the stuff that can really affect change and kind of try to ignore and or hide or replace the rest. Okay, final breakthrough, and then I'll give you the whole list if you want to write them down as well. So breakthrough number 7 is the to-do list method. Now, this is something I somewhat accidentally came across and shared it in Understanding Mixing, but it's this idea of, at some point, when you get close to the end of the mix and you're not sure how much more to do or when you're going to be done, this is such a great way to know. Now, I don't have time to go into it super in-depth, but it's really simple. You take a piece of paper and a pen, and you rewind the song to the very beginning of the song, and you hit play, and then you do not touch anything. Don't touch anything but that pen and that piece of paper. And you just listen, and you make a to-do list of things that you hear that you don't like that you need to fix. And Jeff says, paper and pen, what's that? You can do it on a text document, but I recommend non-computer, so you're not tempted to go adjust things. Because the biggest problem that happens with a lot of people when they're mixing is they go to listen back, and they listen to about 16 seconds of the song if they can make it that far. And by the time they get to second 16, they've already made 4 or 5 tweaks to the song. And chances are the tweak they made to that first 16 seconds of the song messed up the last 2 minutes of the song. Maybe the lead vocal needs to come up there, but it doesn't need to come up the rest of the song, and they already messed it up by turning it up there. So you find yourself working against yourself because you're always constantly tweaking. So what this quote to-do list method will do for you is it allows you to stop and to really identify what are the problems and when are the problems. So not just what is a problem, but when is that a particular problem? Because a lot of times, things like I mentioned before, the lead vocal, it might only be a problem during verse 1. Maybe in verse 1 it's too loud, but everywhere else in the song it's perfect. You need to know that before you start doing anything, or you'll mess up the rest of the song when you try to fix verse 1. So what I suggest is take your piece of paper and label each section of the song as you hear it. So as you start listening to the intro, write intro. And then below that, just make a to-do item for anything you hear that needs to be changed. Or maybe you think it needs to be changed, you're not sure. A lot of times I'll put vocal too loud ? Under verse 1. And then I'll go to verse 2 and I'll make a note. I'll see, okay, I thought it was too loud in verse 1. If the vocal sounds right in verse 2, I'll make a note. Vocal sounds good here. So now I know. When I go back to go through that to-do list, I know if I'm going to adjust verse 1, it needs to be only verse 1. I don't need to adjust the overall level of the vocal for the entire song. It's just verse 1 that needs to be adjusted. So by sitting there, and again, it's going to be hard. You're not going to want to do this. You're going to sit there with a piece of paper, and you're going to take notes. And you're not going to stop the playback. You're not going to stop anything. You're not going to adjust anything. You're literally going to make a list of things that are bothering you in the mix that you need to fix. And then once you're done listening, then you've got your to-do list in front of you. And what I recommend, it's hard to do this, and I don't do it perfectly, but it's to take that piece of paper, and then that's what you do. You start wherever you want on that sheet of paper, and the only things you work on are the things on that list. and you scratch them off when you're done and you move on to the next one. You don't go down the rabbit trail of, it'd be cool to do this. No. At this point in the mix, you've done everything you need to do. Now you're just focusing in on the things that have to get done to get this mix finished. Once you get through your list, you do it again. You listen and you write things down. And what I find is by the third or fourth time, there's very little that you're writing down because you've addressed all the major issues. This can save you a ton of time and also help you know when you're finished. I know I talked about this with VIP members this week or last week. This is just a big, big, big thing that probably, if I'm honest, if 100 people hear this advice, I would predict that less than 10 are going to actually do it. And it's a shame because this is one of my favorite breakthroughs that I had this year that has helped me tremendously, not just finish mixes, but to get them sounding the way I want them to sound and not settling for mixes that I'm not happy with, but also not spending an eternity on a mix that doesn't need all that time invested in it. So if I know I've said that about several of these tips today, but this is one I think if you're going to try any of them, this would be one of them. Maybe this one and breakthrough number 1. Okay, so let's jump in. Let me review here, and I've got time for a couple questions, but my voice is a little gone. I've been sick today, so I'm thankful I was able to come do this webinar. Okay, so to summarize, number 1, these are all my breakthroughs of 2014. Backwards mixing. Number 2, really knowing my frequencies. Number 3, global reverb. Number 4, I stopped ignoring automation. Number 5, templates aren't the devil. Number 6, the problem with problems. In other words, knowing when they're problems and when they're not, or when you can fix them and when you can't. And number 7, the to-do list method. And I'll leave this on the screen for a second if you want to write those down. Brian says, Graham had the same advice about setting a to-do list. Yeah, we both taught each other that, and we've both been doing it. And it's super, super awesome. It's hard to stick to, but I promise it's definitely worth it. Perry says, breakthrough number 8, listen to Joe's 7 breakthroughs. That's awesome. It says it's helped him a lot and brought a lot of things into perspective. Johnny says, can you stop playback? No, not while you're listening. You're literally listening to the song and taking notes as you go. If you don't catch anything, he says, what if there's stuff and you can't make notes fast enough? Write quickly. Use abbreviations. I would say if you stop it, you're kind of defeating. Again, you can stop it. I'm not going to show up behind you and say, hey, you stopped it. But I think for me, it's about listening to the song as a whole. That's really, taking the notes and getting a to-do list is important. But also one of the things that can plague us is we can go an entire mix without actually listening to the song. It sounds ridiculous, right? Who would mix a song without listening to it? But I'm sure you can probably think of 1,000 times you've done this where you realize the only times you listen to the song in its entirety is when you stick it on your iPod and go listen in the car. But you never actually listen to it from start to finish in your studio to get a feel for what it sounds like as an entire piece of music, as something that everyone else in the world is going to hear. They're not going to be able to stop it and adjust things, so why should you? And Johnny said, Joe's going to beat me for stopping playback. I will come through this computer. Let's see. Jeff says, what is it about 400 hertz that makes pro mixers say to give it a cut? I'm finding myself cutting it on everything and sometimes can't even tell what it's doing. Well, sometimes if it's not doing anything, then there's no reason to cut it. But it's just one of those things, especially on drums. It just, for whatever reason, the way drums, their resonant frequencies and the way they vibrate and all that stuff, they just tend to have a lot of stuff happening in that 300 to 500 hertz range. And it's not that you're getting rid of it, it's a lot louder than everything else. So by turning it down, you're kind of evening the playing field so you can hear the low frequencies and the high frequencies without this crazy mid-range, being like that, annoying kid who wants your attention and won't stop talking, right? You gotta say, shh, be quiet for a minute. That's what the EQ will do. Here's another question. Do you still use the backwards mixing method even if you have a low track count? Yeah, I've gotten to the point where even if it's an acoustic song, I'll have a bus for acoustic guitars and a bus for vocals, and I'll start there. And now sometimes I'll do it and it just won't be working, and I'll revert to doing more on the individual tracks. But I think 9 times out of 10, I find that it works better if I do it, if I start with backward mixing first. Nicholas says, do you only reference your mix when you're finishing the mix, or do you reference it a few times during the mix session? For me, I usually do it towards the end. might be a good idea to do it earlier. But for me, I'm so in the zone mixing the song. I want to spend some time with the song without any outside influences. And then when I've gotten it to a point where it's pretty close, it's nice to listen to other stuff to make sure I'm not just crazy off the mark with this one. On the frequency topic, this is from Cortez. Would that work better on the bus or the individual tracks? You mean the knowing your frequencies? I mean, it's just about knowing frequencies. So it depends. I mean, like I said, you're going to start with the bus. So maybe if the whole thing needs a little more 100 hertz, then you do it on the bus. But I don't think that's really the point. The point is you need to know your frequencies. So whenever you use EQ, wherever it is, you'll know what 100 hertz sounds like, what 500 hertz sounds like, so on and so forth. Another question says, so I'm just going to listen to a song one time and write down things while listening. Yeah, that's what I would say. Because what happens, you could listen to it multiple times and take lots of notes, but I think what happens is when you listen to it, the biggest things are going to stand out. And because you can only write so fast, you're only going to be able to write down the bigger problems. And that's good because you need to deal with those first. And then once you deal with those, you'll listen again. And maybe you'll write down some of the little smaller problems, little tiny adjustments that need to be made throughout the song. And then you listen again, and the problems get smaller and smaller as you go through and as you listen over and over. So there's a lot behind it that makes it really helpful. Javier says, how much do you charge for a mix when you spend lots of hours? I charge by the song. So if I spend lots of hours, that's my fault. And so typically I want to hear the music before I mix it. So if it's really bad music, really bad recordings, and I can't do anything with it, I won't take the job. But if I take a long time, that it's kind of a risk that I'm willing to take. I try to go faster and make more money per hour, if that makes sense. Sometimes it takes longer, and that's okay too. Let's see, maybe one more question. Do you also have 3 panning settings, left, right, and center? That's something that I know Graham talks about a lot, LCR panning, where when you pan things in your mix, you pan either hard left, right up the middle, or hard right. That can work a lot of times, especially in rock and things like that. I don't always do that because sometimes it sounds weird, but most of the time I do, and it works really well. I think a lot of people are too afraid to hard pan things left and right, but you're leaving width on the table if you do that. A lot of times you could pan a doubled guitar hard left and hard right, or a guitar hard left and a keyboard hard right, and it sounds great. And if you listen to a lot of pro mixes, you'll find they're doing that a lot too. You may not think they're doing things hard left and right, but they are. And it's definitely, for what it's worth, if the pros are doing it, it's probably worth at least trying, right? I'm not saying they're always right and you have to like it, but there may be something there that you want to pay attention to. Okay, so that wraps up my 7 mixing breakthroughs of 2014. I kind of like doing this. Maybe I'll have to do another one next year for all the things I'm going to learn in 2015. But the point here is to always be learning and expanding your knowledge of mixing and recording and getting better. And yes, that involves things like tutorials and videos and things like this video that you're watching right now, but also it involves just spending time, making time. Make 2015 the year that you get in there and you spend time at whatever interval works for you, every day, every week, every month, but where there's a consistent time where you're getting in your studio and you're getting better. Right? That's what we want. That's what I want for you. That's what I want for myself. And I think we can do it. It just takes a little effort. And I think it's possible though. So thanks again. Thanks for a great 2014. Thanks for being a subscriber. I hope this helps a lot and you get just such better mixes in 2015. It just makes you giggle. That's my goal. So thanks again and see you real soon.